Good day. As with my previous video and the video we published yesterday, I'm making this video while still, I'm afraid, suffering from the cold which I contracted over the weekend, and as a result, this may be a somewhat rambling video, perhaps a little less structured than some of the videos that I usually do. And if so, please accept my apologies in advance. Anyway, in my video yesterday, I discussed the way in which the decision by the Russian authorities, or rather by the authorities of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and by the authorities in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, those parts of those regions which are controlled by the Russians, to call referendums to join their territories to Russia, changes the entire legal and political dynamic of the war in Ukraine. And I also said that this reflects this undoubtedly reflects a debate, a change of policy, a change of direction, which was discussed by the Russian leadership about a week or so ago, directly after the events in Kharkiv. I said that there was a day when there was complete silence from every institution of the Russian government. I said that there was clearly a debate going on about what to do with the situation in Ukraine, and I said that sooner or later we would get an important decision, and the announcement of the referendums were, as it now turns out, a part of the decisions that must have been made on that particular day. Now, to reiterate again, once all of these regions, Kherson region, Zaporozhye region, minus the city of Zaporozhye itself, Donbass, once all of these regions become formally, legally, a part of Russia, any Ukrainian forces that are attacking these regions will be treated by the Russians as attacking Russia itself. And that will mean that we will no longer be in a special military operation any longer. The Russian military will at that point be in a position to respond as it sees fit in order to defend the integrity of Russian territory and to defend Russian citizens living on that territory. Now, the second part of the decisions that were clearly made a few days ago, which I am absolutely sure were discussed, or at least floated or informed about with other Eurasian leaders at the meeting in Samarkand, which is of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has just taken place. The other decision is to announce partial mobilization. Now, the extent of this partial mobilization has been confirmed by Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, following a speech made by Vladimir Putin this morning. Now, Putin's speech was supposed to be published last night and would have taken place alongside the various announcements about the referendums in these various regions of Ukraine. But it was postponed until this morning, I suspect, purely for the reason that perhaps Putin wasn't entirely happy with the draft of the speech which he was given. But anyway, the speech itself is relatively short. I provide a link under this video to the Kremlin transcript. He explains that the situation in Ukraine is existential for Russia, that Russia is facing the collective West, not just Ukraine itself. In Ukraine, he says that the collective West is seeking the breakup of Russia. He touched on that in the press conference he gave in Samarkand, and he announces that there will be partial mobilization. And we know from Shoigu that the partial mobilization will be of Russian military reservists, people who have served in the Russian military, and mostly, or apparently, people who have served in various combat capacities, war veterans who have served in the Russian military. And the total number of people who will be called up will be 300,000 men. Now, that is, according to Shoigu, roughly the same amount as the number of troops that Ukraine has mobilized. According to Shoigu, Ukraine has mobilized nearly 300,000 men over the course of the war. Russia is about to do the same thing. But of course, Russia's mobilization pool is vastly bigger, and the people that it is going to call up are basically trained people who've already served in the military, trained reservists, people with particular skills, specialist skills. And Shoigu was at pains to point out that it amounts to only roughly 1% of Russia's strategic reserves, the reservists that Russia could call upon in any particular war situation. And conscripts and people like that will not be assigned to the war zone. So 300,000 people are being called up, and Shoigu, very interestingly, also gave, for the first time, official Russian figures for losses, both Russian losses and Ukrainian losses. Now, Shoigu said that the Ukrainian army, over the course of the 7 months of fighting, has lost 61,207 dead and 49,368 wounded. Now, I don't know how he obtained such precise figures, but I can only assume, given how precise they are, that they've been obtained through some kind of intelligence collection operation. But anyway, that's the number he says, that those are the numbers of losses that he says Ukraine has suffered. 61,207 dead, 49,368 wounded. And he says that this is nearly half of the original manpower of the Ukrainian military when the war began. That I think is a slight exaggeration, but it does give us some idea of the totality of the losses which the Russians say Ukraine has suffered. And then he gave figures for Russian losses. He said that Russia has lost 5,937 dead. Now, when he says Russia, he means the Russian regular army. He does not mean the Donetsk and Lugansk militia. He's not counting in the Wagner group, the Chechens, those sort of things. So we don't know what the total number of losses of all of those forces is, but for what it's worth, 5,937 dead Russian troops is, in my opinion, most likely true. I'm well aware that, of course, in the West, all kinds of vastly higher numbers have been floated by Western governments, but this seems to me to correspond with the actual numbers of people who the Russians have probably lost. And for what it's worth, they were also fairly close to some of the calculations that the BBC was making some time ago, based on studies of funerals and cemeteries that have taken place up and down Russia. So Shoigu says 5,937 dead. So why have the Russians now moved to partial mobilization? Why have they moved forward to referendums? Why are they moving towards incorporation of all this territory into Russia? What has happened? Well, I think I'd like to go back briefly to the start of the special military operation. And I'm going to say just a few things, a few quick things, before I end this video, whilst my voice lasts, about the kind of strategy that Putin and the Russian government were following at that time. It's quite clear to me that when the Russians started the special military operation back in February, they were following what one might call a Syrian framework for the war. Now, this was something that Alex Christoforou and I discussed extensively in various programs we did at the start of the special military operation on the Duran, and which we've discussed at various times since then. But briefly, the way the Russians conducted their campaign in Syria was as follows. They sent a small number of men, apparently at one point something like 5,000, and they provided air support, intelligence, logistical support, weapon systems, training, command and control to the Syrian army, which, however, did continue to do the bulk of the ground fighting. The Russians themselves were not involved in the ground fighting. They provided air support to the Syrian military and all of these other various things that I've discussed, but they had a clear political decision that they were not going to get drawn into the ground fighting themselves. And as part of that strategy, they also worked towards trying to achieve some kind of diplomatic political settlement of the conflict. In the first year of the Syrian conflict, of their intervention in Syria, they engaged very actively with the United States. I can remember repeated meetings at that time between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Kerry, and they were constantly trying to come up with sorts of agreements and ideas about how to end the conflict. And all of those meetings, all those discussions, in the end came to nothing. But eventually, the diplomatic breakthrough was achieved, and it was achieved between Russia and Turkey, so that in the December of 2016, Russia and Turkey came up with a framework for how the conflict in Syria was to be brought under control and for a political process supposed to secure peace in Syria, which was known as the Astana process because it involved negotiations which took place in Astana. And that framework has essentially continued, and it's now evolved into direct talks between the Turkish and Syrian governments, which have to a great extent been brokered by Russia. And I think the Russians, when they intervened in Ukraine, thought that they might be able to achieve the same thing. So they sent in large numbers of men, far more obviously than in Syria. They sent in people to provide artillery support, air support, support with long-range missile systems, command and control systems, intelligence, all that sort of thing. But the ground fighting in the key battlefield, which was in Donbass, was left principally to the Donbass militia, just as the Syrian army undertook the ground fighting in Syria, so the Donbass militia was supposed to carry out the ground fighting in Donbass. Now, the Russians did deploy for a period of time large numbers of troops from the Russian regular army around North Ukrainian cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, Sumy and Chernigov. But it's increasingly clear that there was no actual plan to try to storm those cities. In fact, this is a little known detail of the war. The Russian army actually briefly occupied the whole of Sumy, one of the important towns in northern Ukraine. They just were able to roll in. There was no Ukrainian resistance to speak of, and they were actually physically in control of the city. And then they just pulled out. Their forces then just went rolling on towards Kiev. They didn't actually stay and try to take control of Sumy itself. And the reason they did that was twofold. Firstly, as the operational chief of the Russian General Staff, General Rudskoy, explained at a briefing he gave on the 24th of March, it was in part intended to pin down Ukrainian troops who might otherwise have been deployed to Donbass, where the main battle was supposed to take place. But the other reason was to put pressure on the Ukrainian government of President Zelensky in order to try to pressure President Zelensky's government with the threat of Russian tanks a few hours away from President Zelensky's office into negotiations. And again, the expectation was that this would result, the hope was that this would result in a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis through direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, similar to the diplomatic solution that was eventually found or largely found in Syria in the talks between Russia and Turkey, and eventually Syria and Turkey brokered by Russia. And this strategy came actually surprisingly close to success. Negotiations did begin between Russia and Ukraine. There were various meetings in Belarus and in Turkey, and on the 29th of March, as I remember reporting, in Istanbul, a breakthrough appeared to have been achieved. Ukraine agreed that it would not join NATO, that it would preserve its neutral status, that it would, in place of joining NATO, seek security guarantees from various powers, which would include Russia itself. That would give Russia veto power over the deployment of foreign troops in Ukraine and over the setting up of foreign bases in Ukraine. Ukraine obviously renounced whatever conceivable plan it might have had to acquire nuclear weapons. And importantly, the security guarantees which Ukraine was seeking would not cover Crimea or Donbass, in effect separating them from the rest of Ukraine and taking the first step towards admitting that they had been lost. And the Russians saw this as very significant progress, and they made an announcement that in light of the progress that was being achieved and the fact that the diplomacy was now on track, that they would pull their troops back from around Kiev, Chernigov, Sumy, as a goodwill gesture. And indeed, those troops did pull back. Now, there's been endless discussion about why the Russians pulled those troops back from those places. This has been suggested by many people that those troops were under immense pressure from Ukraine, that they were in fact driven back. Something I find never really understood, because at least in Kiev, in the areas around Kiev, the Russians were actually expanding their control just before the pullback. They'd actually taken control, as I remember, of of an important town not far from the Chernobyl reactor, where the workers of the Chernobyl reactor were housed. So, it doesn't seem to me as if they really were in any major crisis in there. I personally thought it was because the Russians had successfully, or at least thought they had successfully, choked off supplies to Donbass. And I suspect that was part of the reason. They just captured ETHEREUM at that time. They seem to have believed that ETHEREUM was the city through which, the town through which the Ukrainian supply lines to Donbass flowed, that by controlling ETHEREUM they would be able to choke off supplies to the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. They may very well have believed that, and I suspect they did, but as it turns out, they were wrong. Ukraine was able to redirect supplies to Donbass through other routes, and there's never been a point in time when Ukrainian forces in Donbass have appeared to be significantly without supplies. Anyway, so that may have been part of the calculation, but the Russians themselves, and this is a fact which perhaps people always tend to overlook and ignore, the Russians themselves said at the time, and continue to say, that they pulled out from Kiev, Chernigov and Sumy as a goodwill gesture, because they thought that the negotiations were going to proceed from that point onwards, and that therefore those troops weren't needed because conceptually the Ukrainian government had made the decision to seek the kind of diplomatic settlement that the Russians said they wanted. Well, things then happened. Boris Johnson visited Kiev. He talked Zelensky into changing his stance. Ukraine reneged, took back all the concessions that it had made in Istanbul, and the war went on. And the Russians attempted to continue fighting the war in the same sort of way, in the same kind of manner that they had been fighting it up to then, sticking to what one might call the Syrian variant. They still continued to leave the ground fighting in Donbass to the Donbass militia, largely to the Donbass militia, supplemented by the Chechens and by the Wagner group. They still essentially restricted themselves to providing command and control, intelligence, long-range missile support, artillery support, that sort of thing. There were quite a lot of Russian troops in Donbass, that's clear, and there were obviously Russian troops in Zaporozhye region and in Kherson region, and Russian troops did play a significant role in defending Kherson region and continue to do so, and Russian regular military troops also played an important role in the capture of Mariupol. Troops from the Russian naval infantry there, Marines. But overall, they stuck with the Syrian variant, leaving the fighting, the ground fighting, to the troops in Donbass. And in military terms, it seemed to work, at least for a while. Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were captured, the Russians would say liberated. Donetsk region has been steadily, incrementally cleared of Ukrainian forces. There's been a significant breakthroughs in breaking down Ukrainian defenses in places like opposite Donetsk city. Places like Pesky, Marinka, and the rest are now have now either been captured or are in the process of being captured. And of course, Bakhmut city is now effectively surrounded and likely to fall at some point in the next few weeks. So, in a sense, there was no particular pressure to change things. And this remained the case through April, May, June, July, August, early September. But then, in mid-September, things began to change. Kherson first attempted to launch its Kherson offensive, which had been talking about for weeks and months, which many people, including myself, were beginning to doubt would ever happen. Anyway, they did try and launch it, and it has been an utter failure up to this point. But then they also were able to launch this offensive in Kharkiv region. And though the area around ETHEREUM had clearly lost a lot of its significance, it had failed to choke off, control of it had failed to choke off Ukrainian supplies to Donbass. It had also failed to be the launch pad for the attack on Slavyansk, the northern town that forms the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which is the last big area of Donbass controlled by Ukraine once Bakhmut city falls. Nonetheless, the fact that Ukraine was able to throw troops and recapture Kharkiv, this area of Kharkiv region, was enormously embarrassing, and it caused shockwaves. And it has also garnered for Ukraine headlines all over, favourable headlines all over the world, and it also exposed Putin himself to criticism in Russia. And that has clearly pushed the Russians to review their entire strategy in Ukraine. Now, I've said already that I think this policy of calling referendums and incorporating all of these territories into Russia is one that has already been there for a long time. I mean, you cannot simply call and conduct referendums in the short period that the Russians are saying that will happen unless there's been already extensive preparation to do that. And given that these referendums are supposed to start on the 23rd of September and continue until the 27th of September, even if you consider these referendums something of a sham, that requires a certain degree of organisation, and I've no doubt at all that this has been underway for some time. But the second part of this decision, which is to mobilise, is clearly related to the operational problems on the ground. And Putin spoke about them quite straightforwardly. He said that there is a 1,000 plus kilometre front line. The Russians need more troops to be able to be strong in every part of this front line. Up to this point, they have not been. They've had to juggle forces around. They've had to do what Putin talked about at this press conference in Samarkand that I discussed recently. They've had to decide which territory has priority over which. And the result is this partial mobilization that we're hearing about. 300,000 men. Now, that doesn't mean that all of these 300,000 men are going to be sent to Ukraine. I suspect a lot of them are simply going to replace Russian troops, regular professional troops still stationed in Russia, who will now be deployed to Ukraine. The called up reservists will take their places in Russia itself, making sure that all parts of Russian territory are fully defended. Russia cannot afford to weaken its defences in places like Central Asia, the Far East, the Arctic, wherever. So that's partly what this is all about. And I suspect a large part of these reservists who are deployed to Ukraine will fulfill secondary roles. They will be providing auxiliary services, truck drivers, lorry drivers, that kind of thing. They're not necessarily going to be ground troops who will engage in actual fighting. But one way or the other, we are going to see over the next few weeks and months a very significant increase, a very large increase in Russian forces in Ukraine. And moreover, this is likely to happen at the time when we start to see Ukrainian forces starting to lose some of their own combat effectiveness. Now, I've discussed in recent videos how there appears to have been a major argument within the Ukrainian leadership between General Zaluzhny and advocates, the Ukrainian military chief, and the advocates of Ukrainian offensives, be they President Zelensky himself, or the Americans, or the British. And I've also said that we don't really have any doubt any longer that that debate did indeed happen, because General Zaluzhny published a paper in which he basically said as much, that he didn't want to see offensives. He wanted to hold back his forces, husband his reserves, build them up, re-equip them with Western weapons so that they could keep the fight going on and perhaps even take an offensive at some point, an offensive with some prospect of success in 2023. Now, General Zaluzhny did not get his way. We've seen offensives instead in Kherson region. We've seen this offensive in Kharkiv region. They've all suffered in extremely heavy losses for Ukraine. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, over the course of his comments today, said that Ukraine has lost something like 7,000 dead over the course of the first 3 weeks of September. And that may be right, or it may be wrong, but that there have been severe losses, that is indisputable. Even Ukrainian sources admit this. And of course, large numbers of tanks, machines, artillery, they've also been lost as well as aircraft, of which Ukraine already has only a limited number. So, Ukraine has suffered losses. Its reserves have been badly affected, and the flow of weapon systems from the West to Ukraine is now starting to dwindle. We've had reports of ammunition shortages in the West, that Western ammunition depots are running down, that there simply aren't enough weapon systems lying around in Western arsenals to continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs to sustain the war over the next few months. From this point on, Western governments are having to place orders with their defense industry in order to start providing first themselves with weapon systems that they've already supplied to Ukraine, but also to go on supplying Ukraine with weapons. And that's going to take time. It's going to take several months at the very least before additional supplies of weapons start to be provided to Ukraine. And in some cases, it will take years. And by the way, the new Atlas, Brian Bolertic, has done a very good video discussing the problems with ammunition, which is perhaps the most critical problem of all. In this area, the Russians don't seem to have any problems, by the way. They seem to be abundantly supplied with all the weapons that they need in order to sustain the war. And of course, recently they've also been able to obtain all these kamikaze drones from Iran, which it turns out are much more effective than Russian and American kamikaze drones, and which are now starting to have an actual and significant impact on the fighting. Now, you will have noticed that over the course of this program, I didn't do what I normally do, which is provide you with a rundown of what has been going on the Ukrainian battlefields at the start of this program. The reason is because there hasn't actually been much information about any major developments on the Ukrainian battlefields up to the point of the making of this program. And given that except in Donbass, in the two areas of Bakhmut city and Donetsk city, it's Ukraine that has been everywhere on the attack. That has to some extent to reinforce the sense that it is Ukraine's, since it is Ukraine which has been trying to take the offensive, that it is Ukraine which is now struggling to sustain the momentum of its offensive. We hear of plans to launch amphibious landings on the Kinburn Spit near Kherson city, plans which, if they're true, have already been leaked to the Russians. We hear of further plans to launch attacks in Zaporozhye region, but so far these have not amounted to any actual military action, which suggests that the Ukrainians, at least for the moment, are obliged to take a pause and regroup, which in turn also suggests that they're struggling now to sustain the momentum of their offensives. So it looks like at some point over the next few weeks, months, probably quite soon actually, because I suspect that we're going to see Russian forces redeploying to Ukraine, Russian regular professional forces redeploying to Ukraine quite quickly. I suspect that what we're going to start to see is a fundamental shift, a very dramatic shift in the military dynamics. Now, over the next few weeks, the weather in Ukraine is going to change. We're going to start seeing the autumn rains closing in. The steppe lands of the south of Ukraine will turn into much more boggy or marshy ground, making movements of troops more difficult. And especially if they're Ukrainian, with the kind of Western vehicles that Ukraine has been supplied with. And at that point, I suspect whatever offensives Ukraine has planned or was trying to conduct will probably start to wind down. Ukraine's forces, perhaps depleted, struggling to reinforce. My sense is that Ukraine has probably mobilized all of the manpower by now that it can. There have been 7 mobilization waves in Ukraine. When the weather starts to change again, when it starts to get colder, when the winter closes in, when the ground hardens, it seems to me the pendulum shift will swing back, and it will be the Russians who will be there with the much larger forces, much bigger forces than we've seen at any point in this war up to now. And I suspect that the Russian plan is to bring this war to some kind of conclusion by midwinter. I'm not going to make any further speculations beyond that. I'm not good at timetables, but I think that is a reasonable idea. Now, one thing immediately struck me about these referendum proposals that the Russians are making, which is that the referendum is going to extend to the Russian-controlled areas of Nikolaev region. The Russians are treating this area of Nikolaev region as part administratively of Kherson region, which they control. Now, if that is correct, and if they do hold a referendum in that part of Nikolaev region, which they control, which is not large, it must be said, but which does contain some villages and settlements and those sort of places, then logically, I see no reason why they might not, with all these hundreds of thousands of troops that they're going to start deploying to Ukrainian battlefields, be able to push further towards Nikolaev itself, perhaps beyond that, Odessa, and conduct in future further referendums there. That is, of course, unless Ukraine negotiates. Now, I said previously that the Kharkiv counteroffensive is most likely the high watermark of Ukraine's battlefield success. That if Ukraine is sensible, if the Ukrainian leadership understands that, they will seize this opportunity and to open negotiations with the Russians to see what kind of deals they can achieve, which would allow them to capitalize on this success and go into the negotiations from a stronger position. Well, they didn't do that directly after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and we've now seen the Russian response. Referendums, partial mobilization, the referendums almost certainly after the Russians informed their partners in China and India and perhaps Turkey of this at the summit meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand. So the short window for more favorable negotiations that Ukraine obtained after Kharkiv is now closing again. If I am correct, and we start to see large numbers of Russian troops being deployed after the autumn rains in the winter period, hundreds of thousands of them to be precise, then whatever prospects for negotiations Ukraine has might wither away. Already one Russian parliamentarian, Leonid Slutsky, is saying that after the referendums take place, there will be no point in negotiating with Ukraine anymore. I doubt that is the Russian government position, by the way. But I can easily see how it might become so, unless the Ukrainians seize the moment now. I don't expect them to do it. I don't think that is what they're going to do. But it seems to me the best decision they can make. Anyway, it seems to me that to sort of round off this video, it seems to me that we see again the fundamental reality of the Ukraine war. Whatever ephemeral achievements Ukraine achieves on the battlefields, ultimately its fundamental problem, one that it cannot solve, is that it is up against an adversary, Russia, that is immeasurably more powerful than itself, that has far greater resources than Ukraine has, and which is both able and willing to deploy those resources, because, as Putin said in Samarkand, and as he said in his speech this morning, the Russians see this conflict as an existential matter for themselves, just as the Ukrainians do. So, in the end, Ukraine might win it in a few places from time to time. They might pull off the odd surprise like they did in Kharkiv. But they cannot prevail in this war against a much stronger adversary. Western aid cannot ultimately make that difference. It can provide Ukraine. It bought Ukraine all that Western weaponry that Ukraine was supplied in the early summer, bought Ukraine a few more weeks, a few more months. It made the Kharkiv offensive possible, made the Kherson offensive possible, but it cannot ultimately change the outcome. The sooner this is understood in Kiev and in Western capitals, the better for Ukraine it will be. That understanding, I'm afraid, is nowhere to be seen. I was just reading excerpts from a speech made by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, which I have to say showed all the same blind fanaticism. It's almost the only words I can find to describe it, that he has displayed throughout the whole crisis, going way back into the negotiations that were taking place this time last year, when the Russians were still trying to find some kind of diplomatic solution that would have avoided the war entirely. Stoltenberg and people like him set their face entirely against all of that, to disastrous results, and it seems that they have learnt nothing. Well, there we go. Those who won't learn, won't see, are always in the end, I find, the most destructive of all. Sooner or later, they will no doubt witness the consequences of their folly, but I suspect that in the case of people like Stoltenberg, they still will remain in denial about the reasons for it. But there we go. That's where I'm going to end this video. As I said, I'm not well, as you can probably all tell. In fact, I'm sure you can definitely tell. It's been a bit of a struggle to hold my concentration together through this video. I hope nonetheless you gleaned some useful facts from it, and with that, and without further ado, I will end this program at this point. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on our various other platforms, locals above all, where I do usually live streams every Wednesday, exclusively to locals. Not on this Wednesday. I'm simply not up for it. I'm far too unwell to do it today, but normally on a Wednesday I do live streams on locals. If you want to come join us on locals, you'll find links under this video. Then you can join me on Wednesday and ask me direct questions about any topic, and I'll see if I can answer. And you can also find us on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on BitChute, on Telegram, and soon, by the way, on more places. And last but not least, you can also find, you can find us, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can come to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, despite the somewhat difficult conditions in which it's been made, well, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.